Washington.
On the research side, we're too often playing catch up, given the speed at which online and digital technologies are changing.
Are you worried about your kids' safety on the internet? We are here to help. Washington's 5-step checklist will take you through the process of protecting your kids, and will give you tips on how to set up the best parental controls for your children on their devices. You want what's best for your children. They deserve to be safe online. Our step-by-step guide will help you make sure they are. Download Washington's online safety checklist today to protect your kids online. Find it at protectyourkids.online. That's protectyourkids.online.
Welcome to the Tech Policy Leaders Podcast.
The world's most influential voices keeping you safe and informed online.
Streaming from Washington, D.C., America's tech law and policy epicenter. These are your leaders. This is the podcast.
Tech Policy Leaders with Joe Miller, founder and CEO of Washington.
Washington, safe and informed since 2014.
My guest today is Zeve Sanderson. He's the founding executive director of NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics. His research interests focus on measuring the diffusion and impact of harmful online speech, as well as empirically testing the efficacy of interventions. He regularly writes for and speaks to academic, media, and government audiences. He's finishing his dissertation at Universiteit Amsterdam. Zeve Sanderson. Zeve, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us about the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU and a bit about your background.
Yeah, so NYU Center for Social Media and Politics is an academic research institute that sort of studies our ever-shifting online media environment at scale. And I'll sort of break that apart a little bit in a second. But our goal, and I think this is important to keep in mind, what sort of animates our work is sort of a commitment to strengthening democracy. And we try to do so in three ways. The first is we conduct sort of rigorous research to better understand politics in the digital age. The second is we sort of leverage the research here internally and then across the field in order to advance evidence-based sort of public policy and public discourse. And the final thing is we train the next generation of scholars and students, and that's really core to what we do here. At sort of a high level, our research falls into three buckets. The first is we're really interested in understanding how information spreads online. But we're not just interested in focusing on the diffusion of information, but we're interested in understanding how it impacts sort of people's downstreams, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So there's a lot of work in this growing research field that does things like try to sort of identify how many clicks or likes, a misinformation link might have. For us, that's really important, and we do that sort of work. But we then also try to pair that with other data types. In our case, it's survey data, and I'll talk about that a bit more later in the podcast to try to understand, conditional on being exposed to certain information online. How are people's political attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, such as their affected polarization or for whom they vote, affected? The second is we're really interested in the relationship between social media and political participation. We've done a lot of work thinking about how social media and network structures in particular impact, who shows up to protest and why. And we're getting increasingly interested in who shows up to vote, why, and for whom. And then the third sort of general bucket is we're interested in how political elites respond to this new media environment, right? The old media environment was one with a sort of significant number of gatekeepers that were able to control who was able to speak, when, where, and about what. The sort of social media environment, if not eradicated those gatekeepers, certainly weakened them. And so we're interested in the way that a political elite, both in places like, the US or other more democratic contexts respond, but we're especially interested in authoritarian and competitive authoritarian contexts where, this social media environment really sort of potentially poses an existential threat to their governance.
So now that the election of 2022 is behind us, what are some of the trends you've seen, and what are some of the trends you saw before and after? What were the harms of election disinformation? Were they better? Were they worse than folks were anticipating? What are your thoughts there?
So both from our work and from conversations with folks across sort of different research contexts, it seems like the big storyline here is that relative to 2020, not that much happened online. Last year, we haven't yet seen the move from sort of online speech to offline rallies like we did last year. And so that's the sort of top line finding. I mean, I think there are some nuances in there that are important to remember. There's some work that I saw presented recently by Kate Starberg and colleagues at University of Washington that suggested that election misinformation actually spread faster in the midterms than it did in 2020. But importantly, we didn't see it sort of penetrate or leap from these sort of fringe online communities into sort of mainstream coverage and elite discourse in the way that we did in 2020. And I think that that's sort of a really important dynamic to emphasize here is that, social media matters a lot. It's what I spend most of my day thinking about and studying. But there's a lot of work, that comes to mind by like Yochai Benkler and his colleagues at Harvard that show that, election-related misinformation narratives in 2020 were really a like mass media-led and elite-driven narrative. And so, there was a lot of work that happened on social media to test certain misinformation narratives and figure out which ones were salient. But when it actually came to mainstreaming, the mainstream press and political elites, such as then President Donald Trump, were really a core piece of that dynamic. And so, it's one of the main changes this year relative to 2020 is that Trump wasn't on the ballot. And that he, had largely been locked out of mainstream media relative to his position as then president in 2020. And so while, I spend a lot of time thinking about social media, and certainly it gets quite a bit of coverage in mainstream media, I think it's really important to remember that people's media diets are quite diverse, and traditional media still maintains a sort of central position in terms of the information that people consume.
So what are some of the trends you're seeing now when it comes to specific demographics? I saw a recent report on Latinos in social media, and I should say Marisa Abrajano was the lead researcher on this work. So I will invite her to the show to discuss the issues when it comes to Latinos, Hispanics, and social media. But I noticed it was the most recent paper featured on your site. So I thought it'd be a good idea to get some insights from you on that as well.
So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk about this work. And like you mentioned, sort of Marisa Abrajano and Jonathan Nagler were the two research leads. But I sort of want to contextualize sort of some of our work here, and then I'll talk about some early findings we have because the work is ongoing. So, this work is sort of animated by two challenges when it comes to studying the impact of online and social media on people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, which is where sort of I started with some context around our center. The first is that people's media diets are extremely complex. Right. We don't just go on Facebook, or we don't just listen to radio or watch television. We do all of these things. And so when we're trying to understand what exactly is driving people's attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, we need to sort of pair a bunch of different data sources together, because it's not just enough to, let's say, look at social media or traditional media in a silo. And so what we did here is we recruited a sample of social media users directly via Facebook ads. About 3/4 of this sample, between 2/3 and 3/4 of this sample, identified as Latino or Latinx or Hispanic, and 1/3, and between 1/3 and 1/4 did not. And in addition to going back and running a longitudinal survey, so this means that we survey them multiple times over a period of time, we also have asked them to sort of consent to giving us their social and digital media data. So this is everything from the URLs they visited to the YouTube videos they watched and the tweets that were on their timeline. And so this enables us to have a fairly robust and sort of nuanced picture of what people's online media diets were, and then also offline what they sort of believed and their self-reported behaviors. So that's the sort of first thing to keep in mind. And the second thing is that there's comparatively very little focus on non-English languages when it comes to the study of sort of social and digital media and politics, both in the US and internationally. And this leaves us with like relatively little understanding of this multilingual online media environment, which we know is so important and impactful, especially given the size of the Latino population in the US. So, that's a little bit of context about, why we undertook this project. And then we also, there's a lot of reporting in 2020 about the way that misinformation was potentially sort of leaving Latino Americans particularly vulnerable to certain narratives that, the mainstream media was not picking up on and that researchers had not been studying. So from these first round of surveys, and this is all coming from the surveys itself, we're still dealing with the influx of very sort of complex digital trace and social media data. So the first two big findings from the surveys are that one, people who identify as Latino in the US do use social media differently than folks who do not identify as Latino. Folks who identify as Latino are less likely to use Facebook and YouTube and substantially more likely to use WhatsApp, TikTok, and Telegram. The second main finding is that Latinos who rely on Spanish language social media are more likely to believe in election fraud. So 40% believe Trump received more votes than Biden in 2020 for Latinos who rely on Spanish language social media, relative to just 31% for those who relied on English language social media. Because if you remember, amongst Latinos in the US, they can be split into Spanish dominant, English dominant, and bilingual. And that's something that our research design enables us to look at and then isolate the effect of, let's say, Spanish language social media versus English language social media for Latino communities. So this research is just starting. It's research that we're really sort of excited to continue. And importantly, we're looking for partners on this research, especially community organizations who can tell us what are the misinformation narratives that are salient in their communities so that we can try to understand what might be driving those. And then once we have research findings, hopefully to inform some of their work on the front lines.
A great place to look at is Manassas Park, Virginia. Massive Latino population in Manassas Park in Virginia, where I guess we're back to purple state status now. So that may be an interesting community to study. What are two or three other issues that folks need to be aware of when it comes to social media and politics?
So the first is I'd sort of stress the urgency and importance of empirical research in this space, especially for policymakers who are thinking about regulating or legislating around some of these issues, such as the impact of misinformation and hate speech and harassment. It's sort of interesting. Joshua Tucker, one of our two faculty co-directors, his background before he started studying social media and politics was in sort of post-Soviet politics, mostly in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And if a news show wanted to sort of understand post-Soviet politics, they would go and get a political scientist to come and talk about it. Social media is different because all of us use it all the time, and so we can think that our experience of social media is representative of everybody's experience of social media, and that can then end up sort of biasing the way that policymakers think about legislating or regulating, and media think about sort of covering these issues. So I just sort of want to emphasize that when we think about how social media and digital technologies are transforming society, it's really necessary for this work to be grounded in high quality empirical evidence. And that's really sort of where we excel here at CSMAP, which is thinking about various sort of empirical methods that we can use that, sometimes confirm people's assumptions and sometimes sort of, if not counter them, then certainly provide more nuance. The second, and that this is really important, is that we need access to social media data. It's the only way that we can better understand what's happening online and how it's impacting our society and our politics. And then especially given that there's more regulation, both domestically and internationally, that's focusing on social media, it's the only way we can understand what the impact of policy actually is. And unfortunately, right now, social media data access is entirely at the whims of platforms. We're waiting to see how the DSA in Europe is going to end up sort of requiring certain data access. It's unclear exactly what enforcement will look like, but certainly here in the US, there is no mandated data access. And so one of the reasons why most research in this space is done on Twitter is not because we think Twitter is the most important platform for politics. It's only used by roughly 22% of American adults relative to 80% for YouTube and the low 70s for Facebook. It's because up until now, Twitter has provided the most data access for external researchers. And so we've gone and we've studied Twitter. Obviously, Musk could shut that off at any time. And I recently wrote a piece in The Hill, sort of focusing on this issue and the impact that a change in social media platform ownership could have on data access. So we need government mandated data access. There are a few bills in Congress that would secure this access. And while, Congress doesn't often or hasn't recently moved on much legislation in this space, this is an area that has received bipartisan support. And we hope that they'll consider it in the next Congress.
Is global policy. This is the Washing Tech Policy Podcast, serving the world.
So what a tremendous number of issues we have to think about. It used to be so difficult when I started out in this field, finding this information and getting this granular data about what information audiences were receiving and how they were responding to it. So thanks so much for your work in this space. What literature, movies, and shows are you consuming these days to deepen your knowledge, Zeve, about this space?
Yeah, so I'll sort of focus on one of each. So in terms of books, I recently read Intimacies by Katie Kitamura, and a focus on a translator working at The Hague, translating for sort of war crime trials. And it was a really interesting sort of contemplation of language and the way it impacts our understanding of politics. And even though sort of I come out of political science and a bunch of my colleagues do as well, there's a huge linguistic element to thinking about sort of social media and its impact on society. And so I really enjoyed that book. In terms of a movie, there's a movie that just made its theatrical debut called You Resemble Me by Dina Amer. And it focuses on a young woman named Hasna who lived on the periphery of Paris and ended up being dubbed the sort of first woman suicide bomber. And it sort of focuses on her life, what led her ultimately to be sort of tangentially involved in the Bataclan shootings in Paris, and the sort of actually really incorrect mainstream media coverage of her. It's a sort of great movie, and we just co-sponsored a screening with the director, so I encourage folks to go see it. And then in terms of shows, pretty much all of my television consumption right now is taken up by the World Cup, and so that for me is a really sort of interesting moment where you actually have a good chunk of the world all consuming the same content at the same time. I'm not sure what it means, but I do enjoy participating in it.
It's interesting how some of these experiences can end up being sort of research opportunities. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
Yeah, so I sort of want to make 2 points. So the first is on the research side, we're too often playing catch up, given the speed at which online and digital technologies are changing. So I want to focus on sort of two dynamics. The first is one that's already arrived, and that is the prevalence of video content, and what that means not only for the information that we consume, but also how we study it. A lot of content moderation on platforms is done by automated means, so training of machine learning classifiers to classify certain types of speech. That's something that's been in development on the text side for quite some time. Videos are order of magnitudes harder to classify at scale. And so that's something that's already arrived, and we don't know what the impact of that's going to be. And so there's going to be a lot more work that needs to be done in order to get there. But that's something that we've been thinking about. The second is what we sort of see coming down the pike. And that is the sort of these new generative text, audio, image, and video models. GPT chat is something that is being discussed a lot on Twitter right now. It doesn't actually change the underlying capability of like producing false or manipulated content, right? We've had Photoshop for quite some time. In 2016, the IRA had teenagers producing, tweets. But what it does allow is it sort of lowers the cost of production and increases the potential scale of production of this type of content. And so that's something that I hope both policymakers and media, but also researchers are remaining curious about. What are going to be those sort of downstream impacts on sort of society and for in terms of what we study, politics. So that's the first thing. The second is I really want to sort of come back and stress the importance of the type of research that we do here, and it's the way that it sort of ought to influence our understanding of social media's impact. So I sort of want to provide like an illustrative example. Let's say there are sort of 10 misinformation links, right? Links to news that have been sort of debunked as false by fact checkers, and each has 100 views. There's a question if you're just sort of counting those on social media, which is how many people actually viewed these 10 links cumulatively. We know that the lower bound is 100. It could be the same 100 people viewed all 10 links, and the upper bound could be 1,000. It could be every single view of these 10 links was unique. In terms of like thinking about how we ameliorate the harms of those two situations, those are like very different problems to solve. And that's why we need to move past not just sort of counting what we call the sort of like the numerator, things like how many times was something viewed or shared, but also the sort of denominator, contextualizing this within actual people's media diets and starting to get at some of the downstream effects this online media has on the way that people sort of think and ultimately behave. And so, that's just sort of a call for, policymakers or folks in civil society to reach out, which leads me to how they can get, how they can find us. The first is they can find us on our website, csmapnyu.org, or follow us on Twitter, csmap_NYU. And for any folks that, who are interested in reaching out directly to learn about our work, or especially to sort of get involved in some of our research, they can reach out at csmap@nyu.edu, and I'm on the receiving end of those emails.
Awesome. And Zeve Sanderson is founding executive director of NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics. Zeve, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe.